The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Colonel Richard Hayes stepped out of his office building. At 45 years old, he carried himself with the crisp precision that 23 years of military service had drilled into him. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his jaw set in the perpetual stern expression that had earned him respect and fear in equal measure among the soldiers under his command. The base was bustling with its usual morning activity. Young recruits marched in formation across the parade ground, their voices echoing in unison as drill sergeants barked orders. The smell of breakfast from the mess hall mixed with the familiar sense of diesel fuel and gun oil that permeated every corner of the installation. Colonel Hayes had seen this same scene play out thousands of times over his career, but today something caught his attention that made him stop in his tracks. Near the main gate, hunched over a makeshift cardboard sign, sat an elderly man in tattered clothing. The man's hair was gray and unkempt, his face weathered by years of hardship, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. What struck the colonel most was the man's military-issued jacket, faded and worn but still recognizable. The jacket bore the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, and even from a distance, Hayes could make out several service ribbons sewn onto the chest. The old man's cardboard sign read in shaky handwriting, "Homeless veteran, served in Vietnam. Any help appreciated, God bless." A small paper cup sat beside him, containing only a few coins and crumpled dollar bills. Despite the early hour, the veteran sat with military posture, his back straight and his eyes alert, scanning the faces of people who hurried past without acknowledgement. Colonel Hayes felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had encountered homeless veterans before, but something about this particular man stirred emotions he had worked hard to suppress. The colonel prided himself on maintaining order and discipline, both in his personal life and on his base. In his mind, soldiers were supposed to be strong, self-reliant, and capable of overcoming any obstacle. The sight of this broken-down veteran challenged everything he believed about military strength and honor. As Hayes watched, several base personnel walked past the old man without so much as a glance. Some actively avoided eye contact, while others whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the presence of the homeless veteran so close to their workplace. The colonel noticed how the man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his sign, and how his eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation that came from countless days of being ignored. The morning briefing was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, but Hayes found himself unable to move. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Part of him wanted to approach the veteran and offer assistance, recognizing a fellow soldier who had served his country with honor. Another part of him, the part shaped by years of command and the weight of maintaining military standards, saw only weakness and failure. The colonel's radio crackled to life, reminding him of his duties. Major Thompson's voice came through clearly, asking about the morning's schedule and whether Hayes would be attending the joint training exercise later that day. Hayes responded automatically, his voice steady and professional, but his eyes remained fixed on the homeless veteran. As more people began to arrive for the day shift, the area around the gate became increasingly busy. Hayes watched as civilians and military personnel alike gave the old man a wide berth, some looking uncomfortable, others appearing annoyed by his presence. A few tossed coins into his cup without stopping or making eye contact, treating him more like an obstacle to navigate around than a human being deserving of basic dignity. The veteran never asked for anything directly. He simply sat there with quiet dignity, his weathered hands clasped in his lap, occasionally nodding gratefully when someone dropped a coin or two into his cup. There was something deeply unsettling to Hayes about the man's calm acceptance of his situation, as if he had long ago stopped expecting anything more from the world around him. Hayes pulled out his phone and quickly researched the insignia he had observed on the man's jacket. The 82nd Airborne Division had indeed served with distinction in Vietnam, participating in some of the conflict's most dangerous and significant operations. These were paratroopers, elite soldiers who had jumped behind enemy lines and fought in conditions that most people could never imagine. The realization that this homeless man sitting outside his base might have once been one of these elite warriors sent a chill down the colonel's spine. The morning sun climbed higher, and Hayes realized he was already late for his briefing. He took one last look at the homeless veteran, noting how the man's posture remained military straight despite his obvious exhaustion and hunger. Something about the old soldier's quiet dignity in the face of such hardship both impressed and infuriated the colonel in ways he couldn't quite understand. 3 days passed, and each morning Colonel Hayes found himself taking the same route past the main gate. The homeless veteran had become a fixture there, arriving before dawn and maintaining his position until well after sunset. Hayes had made discreet inquiries with the base security team and learned that the man's name was Thomas Mitchell, age 72, and that he had been camping in the woods just outside the base perimeter for several weeks. The more Hayes observed Mitchell, the more conflicted he became. The old veteran never caused trouble, never harassed anyone for money, and always maintained a respectful demeanor. Yet his very presence seemed to serve as a constant reminder of something Hayes preferred not to think about. The colonel had built his entire identity around the idea that military service created strong, capable individuals who could overcome any challenge. Mitchell's situation directly contradicted this belief. On Thursday morning, Hayes decided to gather more information. He asked Sergeant Williams, who worked at the main gate, to provide a detailed report on Mitchell's behavior and any interactions with base personnel. Williams, a 20-year veteran himself, seemed uncomfortable with the assignment, but complied with his superior's orders. The report revealed disturbing details about Mitchell's daily routine. He survived on one small meal per day, usually purchased from a nearby convenience store when he had enough money. He kept his belongings in a single backpack and slept under a bridge about 2 miles away. Most troubling to Hayes was the information that Mitchell had tried multiple times to access veterans' services but had been turned away due to missing paperwork and bureaucratic complications. Williams also reported that several younger soldiers had begun stopping to talk with Mitchell during their breaks. The old veteran had apparently served 3 tours in Vietnam and had been awarded a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his service. These conversations were beginning to draw attention, and some of the soldiers were starting to ask questions about why the military couldn't do more to help one of their own. This development particularly concerned Hayes. He prided himself on maintaining strict discipline and clear hierarchies within his command. The sight of active duty soldiers fraternizing with a homeless person, even a veteran, struck him as unprofessional and potentially damaging to unit cohesion. In his view, Mitchell's presence was becoming a distraction that threatened the good order and discipline of his base. That afternoon, Hayes called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss what he termed the situation at the main gate. Major Thompson, Captain Rodriguez, and Sergeant Major Davis gathered in the colonel's office, where Hayes laid out his concerns about Mitchell's continued presence and its potential impact on base operations. Major Thompson, a career officer in his 30s, immediately supported the colonel's position. He argued that allowing Mitchell to remain near the base sent the wrong message to both military personnel and civilians about standards and expectations. Captain Rodriguez, however, seemed less certain. As the base's liaison with Veterans Affairs, she had first-hand knowledge of the challenges facing homeless veterans and the systemic failures that often led to their situations. Sergeant Major Davis, the most senior enlisted man present, remained notably quiet during the discussion. Hayes had known Davis for 8 years and respected his judgment, but on this occasion the sergeant major seemed reluctant to offer his opinion. When pressed, Davis simply stated that Mitchell appeared to be a good soldier who had fallen on hard times and suggested that perhaps the base could connect him with appropriate resources. Hayes dismissed this suggestion, arguing that military bases were not social service agencies and that individual hardship cases were not their responsibility. He had decided that Mitchell's presence was becoming a problem that needed to be addressed decisively. The colonel announced his intention to personally handle the situation the following morning, though he did not specify exactly what action he planned to take. That evening, Hayes found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine. He attempted to review personnel files and prepare for the next day's training exercises, but his mind kept returning to Mitchell and the uncomfortable questions the old veteran's presence raised. Hayes had always believed that military service instilled values and skills that prepared individuals for success in civilian life. Mitchell's situation forced him to confront the possibility that this belief might be overly simplistic. The colonel spent several hours researching veteran homelessness online, reading statistics and case studies that painted a troubling picture of the challenges facing those who had served their country. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of veterans living on the streets, struggling with physical injuries, mental health issues, and a society that often seemed indifferent to their sacrifice. Despite this research, Hayes remained convinced that Mitchell's presence at the base was inappropriate and potentially harmful. He had made his decision about how to handle the situation, and he intended to follow through regardless of any personal discomfort he might feel. The colonel believed that sometimes leadership required making difficult decisions that others might not understand or appreciate. As he prepared for bed, Hayes reviewed his plan for the following morning. He would approach Mitchell directly and make it clear that his continued presence near the base was unacceptable. The colonel convinced himself that this was not only necessary for maintaining proper standards, but also potentially helpful for Mitchell, who might be motivated to seek proper assistance once he understood that his current situation was untenable. Friday morning arrived with an unusual chill in the air. Colonel Hayes had barely slept, his mind churning with thoughts about the confrontation he had planned. He rose earlier than usual, showered with military precision and dressed in his most imposing uniform. Every ribbon, every piece of brass gleamed perfectly under the fluorescent lights of his quarters. He wanted to make an impression that would leave no doubt about his authority and the seriousness of his message. As Hayes walked toward the main gate, he noticed that Mitchell was already in position despite the early hour. The old veteran sat with the same quiet dignity he had displayed every day for the past week, his cardboard sign propped against his knee, his paper cup containing perhaps $2 in coins. What struck Hayes differently this morning was the way the rising sun illuminated Mitchell's face, revealing deep lines carved by decades of hardship and eyes that held stories the colonel could only imagine. Several base personnel were arriving for their shifts, and Hayes observed their interactions with Mitchell. Specialist Johnson, a young soldier barely out of basic training, stopped to drop a dollar bill into the cup and exchange a few words with the old veteran. Private Martinez paused to shake Mitchell's hand, and Hayes caught fragments of their conversation about service medals and unit deployments. These interactions confirmed the colonel's belief that Mitchell's presence was creating exactly the kind of unprofessional atmosphere he sought to eliminate. Hayes approached with measured steps, his military bearing unmistakable. Mitchell looked up as the colonel drew near, and for a moment their eyes met. The old veteran's gaze held no challenge or defiance, only a weary recognition of authority that spoke to decades of military conditioning. Mitchell began to struggle to his feet, an instinctive response to the presence of a superior officer, but Hayes gestured for him to remain seated. The colonel positioned himself directly in front of Mitchell, close enough that his shadow fell across the old man's weathered face. Hayes had rehearsed this moment in his mind, planning exactly what he would say to make his position clear while maintaining the dignity appropriate to his rank. He intended to be firm but professional, authoritative but not unnecessarily cruel. Instead, something unexpected happened. As Hayes opened his mouth to deliver his prepared speech, he noticed details about Mitchell that he had missed from a distance. The old veteran's hands bore scars that could only have come from combat, and his left leg was clearly damaged, possibly from an old wound that had never properly healed. The military decorations on his faded jacket were not reproductions or stolen valor. They were genuine awards earned through service and sacrifice. Hayes felt a momentary hesitation, a crack in his resolve that he quickly suppressed. He reminded himself of his duty to maintain standards and protect the integrity of his command. The colonel reached into his mind for the speech he had prepared, words designed to convince Mitchell that his presence was inappropriate and that he needed to move along to seek help elsewhere. But as Mitchell looked up at him with patient acceptance, Hayes felt something snap inside him. All the frustration and anger he had been carrying about the situation, all his discomfort with the challenges that Mitchell's presence represented, suddenly focused into a single moment of rage. The careful, professional approach he had planned dissolved into something much more primitive and destructive. Without warning, Hayes turned and walked rapidly toward a maintenance shed near the gate. His movements were sharp and purposeful, though anyone watching might have wondered what had suddenly captured his attention. Inside the shed, he found what he was looking for: a large plastic bucket that maintenance crews used for various cleaning tasks around the base. The colonel filled the bucket with cold water from a nearby spigot, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency, while his mind raced with justifications for what he was about to do. He told himself that Mitchell needed a wake-up call, that sometimes shock therapy was necessary to motivate people to change their circumstances. He convinced himself that this dramatic gesture would serve the dual purpose of solving his immediate problem while potentially helping Mitchell understand the seriousness of his situation. Hayes carried the bucket back toward where Mitchell sat, his stride confident and determined. Several base personnel noticed his approach, their conversations trailing off as they sensed that something significant was about to happen. The morning air seemed to grow quieter, as if the entire base was holding its breath in anticipation of an event that no one quite understood, but everyone instinctively knew would be important. Mitchell remained in his position, unaware of what was approaching. He had returned his attention to his cardboard sign, perhaps adjusting its position to catch the attention of passing personnel. His weathered hands moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to make the most of very little, treating even a simple sign as if it were important equipment that deserved proper care and attention. The distance between Hayes and Mitchell closed rapidly. The colonel's grip on the bucket handle tightened, and his jaw set in the same determined expression that had carried him through countless difficult decisions during his military career. In his mind, he was not about to humiliate an elderly veteran. He was taking decisive action to solve a problem that threatened the good order and discipline of his command. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity as Colonel Hayes raised the bucket above his head. Mitchell looked up just as the cold water came crashing down, soaking him completely from head to toe. The old veteran's cardboard sign dissolved instantly. His few belongings were scattered, and the small amount of money in his cup was washed away across the concrete. The shock of the cold water caused Mitchell to gasp and struggle to breathe, his aged body reacting violently to the sudden assault. For several seconds, absolute silence fell over the area near the main gate. Base personnel who had been going about their morning routine stopped dead in their tracks, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Specialist Johnson, who had been talking with Mitchell just minutes earlier, stood frozen with his mouth open. Private Martinez dropped the coffee cup he had been carrying, the sound of breaking ceramic echoing strangely in the quiet morning air. Mitchell sat dripping and shivering, his thin frame shaking from both cold and shock. Water dripped from his gray hair and ran in streams down his weathered face. His faded military jacket, now soaked through, clung to his frail body, making him appear even smaller and more vulnerable than before. Despite the humiliation and physical discomfort, Mitchell did not cry out or protest. He simply sat there, looking up at Hayes with an expression of profound sadness and confusion. Hayes stood over the soaked veteran, the empty bucket still in, his hands breathing heavily as if he had just completed a challenging physical exercise. The colonel's carefully maintained composure began to crack as he realized that dozens of people had witnessed his actions. Base personnel, civilians, and even some visitors were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to outright anger. Sergeant Major Davis, who had been approaching the gate for his morning inspection, arrived just in time to see the aftermath of Hayes's attack. The experienced enlisted man's face went through a series of emotions as he processed the scene before him. Davis had served under Hayes for 8 years and had always respected the colonel's leadership, but what he saw now challenged everything he believed about military honor and the treatment of veterans. The first person to move was Captain Rodriguez, who rushed forward with a blanket she had grabbed from a nearby vehicle. She knelt beside Mitchell, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders and speaking softly to him in both English and Spanish. Rodriguez's actions seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone else in place, and suddenly the area erupted into activity as people rushed to help the soaked veteran. Specialist Johnson appeared with a thermos of hot coffee, while Private Martinez offered his own jacket to provide additional warmth. Other soldiers quickly gathered Mitchell's scattered belongings and began searching for the coins that had been washed away from his cup. Their actions stood in stark contrast to Hayes's assault, demonstrating the compassion and brotherhood that the colonel's behavior had so dramatically violated. Hayes found himself standing alone, still holding the empty bucket, as a crowd formed around Mitchell. The colonel's position of authority, which had always commanded immediate respect and obedience, now seemed to isolate him from everyone around him. He could hear whispered conversations among his personnel, words like disgraceful and unbelievable carried on the morning breeze. Major Thompson arrived on the scene, having been summoned by reports of a disturbance at the main gate. When he saw the situation, his face went pale, and he immediately approached Hayes with urgent questions about what had happened. The colonel's explanation that he had been addressing a loitering problem sounded hollow and unconvincing, especially with Mitchell still sitting wrapped in a blanket, clearly suffering from the effects of his unexpected cold shower. Word of the incident spread rapidly throughout the base via text messages, social media, and simple word of mouth. Within an hour, virtually everyone on the installation knew that Colonel Hayes had dumped a bucket of water on a homeless Vietnam veteran. The story grew more detailed with each telling, but the basic facts remained consistent and deeply troubling to anyone who heard them. Several base personnel began taking photos and videos of the aftermath, despite Hayes's angry demands that they stop. In the age of smartphones and social media, the colonel's assault on Mitchell was being documented and shared faster than he could control. Captain Rodriguez, in particular, made sure to photograph Mitchell's military decorations and document his condition for what she suspected might become an official investigation. As the morning progressed, Hayes found himself increasingly isolated. Personnel who had previously greeted him with enthusiastic, "Good morning, sir," now avoided eye contact or offered only the most minimal acknowledgments required by military protocol. The colonel realized that his intended demonstration of authority had backfired spectacularly, transforming him from a respected leader into someone viewed with suspicion and disappointment. Mitchell, meanwhile, was slowly recovering with the help of the soldiers who had come to his aid. Despite his ordeal, he expressed gratitude for their kindness and repeatedly insisted that he did not want to cause any trouble for anyone. His grace under such difficult circumstances only served to highlight the cruelty of Hayes's actions and the contrast between the old veteran's dignity and the colonel's lack of it. By noon, Hayes received an urgent call from the base commander's office requesting his immediate presence for a meeting. The colonel knew that his career was about to face its most serious challenge, but he was not yet prepared for how completely his world was about to change. Within hours of the water bucket incident, cell phone videos of the aftermath began appearing on social media platforms. The images of Mitchell sitting soaked and shivering while being comforted by young soldiers created an immediate and powerful emotional response from viewers. The hashtag #TheArmedVeteranDeservesBetter began trending locally, then regionally, and by evening had gained national attention. Local news stations picked up the story by late afternoon. Channel 7's investigative reporter Sarah Chen had received a tip from someone who witnessed the incident and immediately recognized its significance. Chen's initial report focused on the basic facts. A high-ranking military officer had dumped water on a homeless Vietnam veteran who was peacefully sitting near a military base. The story included interviews with base personnel who had witnessed the event, though most spoke anonymously due to concerns about potential retaliation. The base commander, General Patricia Williams, called Colonel Hayes into her office at 1400 hours. Williams was a no-nonsense officer who had earned her position through 3 decades of exemplary service and had a reputation for handling difficult situations with both wisdom and firmness. When Hayes entered her office, he found not only the general but also the base legal officer and a representative from the public affairs office. General Williams wasted no time with pleasantries. She had already reviewed preliminary reports from multiple witnesses and had seen the social media posts that were rapidly spreading across the internet. Her first question to Hayes was simple and direct. "Colonel, did you or did you not dump a bucket of water on Thomas Mitchell this morning?" Hayes's confirmation of the basic facts led to a series of increasingly difficult questions about his motivations and his understanding of military values. The legal officer, Major Jennifer Walsh, informed Hayes that the incident was being investigated as a potential assault, and that Mitchell would be within his rights to press criminal charges. Additionally, the military was opening its own investigation into Hayes's conduct, which could result in court-martial proceedings depending on the findings. The public affairs representative, Captain Mark Stevens, outlined the media attention the story was already receiving and warned that it was likely to grow significantly larger in the coming days. Meanwhile, Thomas Mitchell had been taken to the base medical facility for evaluation and treatment. Dr. Elizabeth Murphy, the attending physician, found that while Mitchell had not suffered serious physical injury from the water dousing, his overall health was poor due to malnutrition and exposure. More concerning to Dr. Murphy was Mitchell's emotional state. The old veteran seemed deeply depressed and kept apologizing for causing trouble, as if the assault had been somehow his fault. Captain Rodriguez, who had stayed with Mitchell throughout his medical evaluation, took it upon herself to contact Veterans Services organizations to arrange proper assistance for him. Her calls revealed the systematic failures that had led to Mitchell's homelessness in the first place. His military records had been lost in a fire decades earlier, making it difficult to verify his service and access benefits. He had been bounced between various agencies, each claiming that his case fell under someone else's jurisdiction. By evening, the story had reached national news outlets. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC all ran segments about the incident, using it as a launching point for broader discussions about veteran homelessness and the treatment of those who had served their country. Political commentators from across the spectrum found common ground in condemning Hayes's actions, though they differed on what systemic changes might be needed to prevent similar situations. The base began receiving calls from across the country. Some were from outraged citizens demanding that Hayes face consequences for his actions. Others were from veterans advocacy groups offering assistance to Mitchell and requesting information about his needs. Perhaps most surprising were the calls from individuals and organizations offering to donate money, housing, and other support to help Mitchell get back on his feet. Social media amplified every aspect of the story. Veterans shared their own experiences with homelessness and bureaucratic indifference. Active duty military personnel posted about their shame at being associated with Hayes's behavior. Military families expressed their disappointment that someone in a position of leadership could treat a fellow veteran with such cruelty and disrespect. Hayes spent the evening in his quarters, officially relieved of duty pending the outcome of the investigation. He attempted to draft a statement explaining his actions, but every version he wrote seemed to make the situation worse. His justifications about maintaining base security and military standards sounded hollow when contrasted with the reality of what he had done to a 72-year-old veteran who posed no threat to anyone. The colonel's wife, Susan, called from their home in another state where she was caring for her elderly mother. She had seen the news reports and was struggling to reconcile the man she had married with the person described in the media. Their conversation was difficult and painful, with Susan expressing both disappointment and confusion about how her husband could have acted so callously towards someone who clearly needed help, rather than harassment. Late that night, Hayes received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Major Davis knocked on his door, requesting permission to speak privately. Davis, who had served with distinction for 28 years, had never before challenged a superior officer. But the events of the day had shaken his faith in the military hierarchy he had devoted his life to serving. Davis told Hayes that he had spent the afternoon talking with the soldiers who had witnessed the incident. Many were questioning whether they wanted to continue serving in an organization where senior leaders could treat veterans so poorly. The sergeant major warned that the colonel's actions had damaged not just his own reputation, but the reputation of the entire military, potentially affecting recruitment and the public's trust in the armed forces. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Davis speaking more candidly than he ever had about leadership, honor, and the responsibilities that came with wearing the uniform. By the time the sergeant major left, Hayes was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had initially imagined. The incident was becoming a symbol of everything that could go wrong when military leaders lost sight of the values they were supposed to represent. 3 days after the water bucket incident, the story had exploded into a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. Major television networks sent crews to the base, and the small town outside the installation found itself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Local businesses began displaying signs supporting veterans, and a makeshift memorial appeared at the spot where Mitchell had been sitting when Hayes attacked him. The investigation into Hayes's conduct moved swiftly. Military police interviewed dozens of witnesses, collected video evidence from security cameras and personal devices, and compiled a comprehensive report that painted a damning picture of the colonel's actions. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Hayes had deliberately and maliciously assaulted an elderly veteran who posed no threat and had committed no crime. General Williams held a press conference to address the growing media attention and public outrage. Standing before a room packed with journalists, she condemned Hayes's actions in the strongest possible terms and announced that he would face court-martial proceedings. She also outlined new initiatives the base would implement to better support homeless veterans and prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Thomas Mitchell, meanwhile, had become an unlikely celebrity. Veterans organizations had rallied around him, providing temporary housing in a nearby hotel and connecting him with legal advocates who were working to restore his access to benefits and services. A GoFundMe campaign started by Captain Rodriguez had raised over $50,000 in just 3 days, with donations coming from active military personnel, veterans, and civilians who had been moved by his story. Despite the overwhelming support, Mitchell remained reluctant to speak publicly about what had happened to him. He repeatedly expressed concern that the attention might hurt other homeless veterans who were not fortunate enough to have cameras recording their mistreatment. His humility and continued focus on others, even after his own traumatic experience, only increased public admiration for him and anger toward Hayes. The legal proceedings against Hayes began with preliminary hearings to determine the charges he would face. Military prosecutors argued for multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and bringing discredit upon the armed forces. Hayes's military defense attorney struggled to find any justification for his client's actions that would resonate with a court-martial panel. Hayes himself had become increasingly isolated. Most of his former colleagues avoided him, unwilling to be associated with someone whose actions had brought such negative attention to the military. His wife had returned home and was considering divorce, unable to reconcile her husband's behavior with the values she thought they shared. The colonel found himself spending most of his time alone, reviewing his career and trying to understand how he had reached such a low point. The broader impact of the incident continued to grow. Congressional representatives began calling for investigations into veteran homelessness and the systemic failures that led to situations like Mitchell's. Veterans advocacy groups used the story to highlight the broader crisis of homeless veterans, noting that Mitchell's experience, while now highly publicized, was unfortunately not unique. Military recruitment centers reported that the incident was affecting their ability to attract new enlistees. Young people and their parents were asking pointed questions about military values and whether the organization truly cared for its members after their service ended. The damage to the military's reputation was becoming increasingly clear, and senior leaders recognized that Hayes's actions had created problems that would take years to fully address. Captain Rodriguez, who had emerged as an unofficial spokesperson for the base's response to the incident, was promoted ahead of schedule and given new responsibilities for veteran outreach programs. Her compassionate response to Mitchell's situation had become a model for how military personnel should treat those who had served before them. She used her new platform to advocate for systemic changes in how the military and veteran services organizations work together. The young soldiers who had comforted Mitchell after the attack received commendations for their actions, but more importantly, they had learned powerful lessons about leadership and moral courage. Specialist Johnson later said that witnessing Hayes's cruelty and then seeing the public response had taught him more about military values than any classroom instruction ever could. As the court-martial proceedings approached, Hayes was forced to confront the full magnitude of his actions. His attorneys advised him that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that his best option might be to accept responsibility, express genuine remorse, and hope for leniency in sentencing. The colonel who had once prided himself on making tough decisions now faced the toughest decision of his life, whether to fight the charges and risk a harsher sentence or admit his guilt and accept the consequences of his actions. The incident had also sparked a broader examination of military culture and the pressures that might lead someone in Hayes's position to act so callously. Military psychologists and leadership experts began studying the case to understand how a career officer with no previous disciplinary problems could commit such a shocking act of cruelty against a fellow. Veteran Mitchell's story, meanwhile, continued to inspire positive action. Homeless shelters across the country reported increased donations and volunteer support. Veterans organizations saw spikes in membership and funding. Local communities began implementing new programs to identify and assist homeless veterans in their areas. The old soldiers' suffering had inadvertently become a catalyst for meaningful change in how society treated its most vulnerable veterans. 6 months after the water bucket incident, the transformation of everyone involved was complete and profound. Colonel Richard Hayes had been court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and sentenced to 6 months in military prison, followed by a dishonorable discharge. His 23-year military career ended in disgrace, and he faced the challenge of rebuilding his life as a civilian with a criminal record and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. The court-martial proceedings had been covered extensively by the media, serving as a stark reminder that actions have consequences regardless of rank or position. During his sentencing, Hayes had finally offered a genuine apology to Mitchell and the military community, acknowledging that his behavior had been inexcusable and had betrayed the values he had sworn to uphold. His words seemed sincere, but they could not undo the damage he had caused to both Mitchell and the military's reputation. Thomas Mitchell's life had changed dramatically in ways he never could have imagined. The donations from his GoFundMe campaign, combined with the restoration of his military benefits, had provided him with stable housing for the first time in years. He now lived in a small apartment near the base, furnished with donations from military families and local businesses who had been moved by his story. More importantly, Mitchell had found a new purpose in life. He had become an advocate for homeless veterans, working with Captain Rodriguez and various veterans organizations to identify and assist others who were struggling with homelessness and bureaucratic barriers. His quiet dignity and first-hand experience, with both the problems and potential solutions, made him an effective spokesman for change. The veteran's health had improved significantly. With proper nutrition and medical care, Dr. Murphy, who continued to monitor his progress, noted remarkable improvements in both his physical condition and his mental health. Mitchell had also reconnected with distant family members who had seen the news coverage and reached out to re-establish relationships that had been broken by years of homelessness and pride. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to major and given responsibility for developing a comprehensive veteran outreach program that was being implemented at military bases across the country. Her compassionate response to Mitchell's situation had made her a rising star in the military, and she was frequently called upon to speak at conferences about military values and leadership. The program she developed had already helped dozens of homeless veterans access services and support. The base itself had undergone significant changes in culture and policy. General Williams had implemented new training programs focused on military values in the treatment of veterans. The incident with Hayes had served as a wake-up call about the importance of moral leadership and the consequences of failing to live up to military standards. Morale had actually improved as personnel felt proud to be part of an organization that had taken strong action to address misconduct and implement positive changes. Sergeant Major Davis had been selected for promotion and was preparing to take a new assignment at the Pentagon, where he would help develop military-wide policies for supporting veterans. His candid conversation with Hayes after the incident had marked a turning point in his own career, demonstrating that moral courage sometimes required challenging authority when principles were at stake. The young soldiers who had witnessed the incident and helped Mitchell had all advanced in their careers, with several being selected for leadership development programs. Specialist Johnson had been promoted twice and was studying for his sergeant's examination. He frequently spoke about how the incident had taught him that true leadership meant protecting and caring for others, especially those who were vulnerable. The broader impact of the incident continued to resonate throughout American society. Congress had passed new legislation streamlining the process for homeless veterans to access benefits and services. The bureaucratic barriers that had trapped Mitchell in homelessness for years were being systematically eliminated. Through policy changes inspired by his story, veterans organizations reported record levels of support and engagement from both veterans and civilians. The incident had reminded the American people of their obligations to those who had served their country, leading to increased funding for veteran programs and a renewed focus on preventing veteran homelessness. Hayes, after serving his prison sentence, had attempted to rebuild his life by working with a veterans organization that helped former military personnel transition to civilian careers. Ironically, his own experience with disgrace and loss had given him insights into the challenges faced by veterans who struggled with reintegration. He worked quietly and without publicity, aware that his presence might be unwelcome but committed to making whatever positive contribution he could. The spot outside the base where Mitchell had once sat with his cardboard sign had been transformed into a small memorial garden honoring homeless veterans. A bronze plaque told Mitchell's story and served as a reminder to all who passed by about the importance of treating veterans with the dignity and respect they had earned through their service. Mitchell himself often visited the memorial, not to remember his own suffering, but to think about the veterans who had died on the streets without receiving the help they needed. He had made it his mission to ensure that his story would serve as a catalyst for lasting change, rather than just a momentary sensation. The incident that had begun with a moment of cruelty had ultimately demonstrated the power of compassion, accountability, and collective action. Hayes's attack on Mitchell had shocked the nation, but the response from military personnel, veterans organizations, and ordinary citizens had reaffirmed the values that the colonel's actions had betrayed. Mitchell's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had inspired thousands of people to take action on behalf of homeless veterans, creating a legacy that would outlast any individual involved in the story. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every day, Mitchell and the many people inspired by his story worked to ensure that no veteran would ever again have to sit alone and forgotten outside the gates of the military installations where they had once served with honor.